Good afternoon. I'm Anne Pellegrini, and on behalf of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, which has teamed up with Deutsches Haus in particular to launch this spectacular celebration of the telephone book. Really thrilled to welcome you this afternoon with my co-conspirators, Ben Kafka from Media, Culture, and Communication, one of our other co-sponsors, and of course, she who needs no introduction, but we introduce her anyway, Avital Ronell, the alleged operator of the telephone book. You all should have, maybe you're even sitting on one of these beautiful programs. I did just want to send out a few thank yous to the co-sponsors of this event. As I said, this has been a real team effort. So grateful to Deutsches Haus for all of their support. MCC, the Department of Performance Studies, huge support from the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD, and a special thanks to the NYU Office of the Vice-Provost for Faculty, Arts, Humanities, and Diversity, and the NYU Office of the Dean for Humanities. And we're really, really especially pleased, Joy Connolly, the Dean for the Humanities, is here with us this afternoon to help give some, sort of welcome you officially to NYU and to this event. And let me present to Avital to present to Joy, a little object some of you may have heard of. And at 25 years, the book doesn't look a day over 20.
So my name is Joy Connolly. I'm a professor of classics, and I'm the dean for humanities in the Faculty of Arts and Science at NYU. And it's my great honor and great pleasure to welcome you all to the celebration of the 25th birthday of the telephone book, an influential work by an influential scholar who's also our deeply admired colleague, Avital Ronell. And I was going to ask you, and I questioned doing it, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to ask you to kick off the evening. Can you join me a second time in thanking Avital for creating the book? That's the occasion of our coming together. Most of the encounters we have with books that turn out to be important in our lives are encounters with objects, and I just received one right now, which I'm very grateful for. I mean, we meet books as bound printed objects, bound printed pages. Now, of course, we meet them as words on a screen that we scroll through, and I can't help noticing the fascinating transformation of noun to verb in that word scroll. But the point is, the encounter with a book is generally a long-distance one in the sense that it summons that unnerving sense of simultaneous separation and connection that Avital writes about so eloquently in the book we're celebrating tonight. But my first encounter with the telephone book was not long distance, in fact. It was face-to-face. I can't swear to the year. Avital may be able to clarify. It was 89 or 90 or 91. But Avital delivered a lecture at Princeton where I was then studying classics. I was a classics student, even then, as now. So I was deep in the throes of studying Greek and Latin and probably working on my thesis on Ezra Pound. And I walked out of Avital's lecture, I have to say, in a state of dazed overstimulation and a strong sense of lost time. And it was a somewhat angry sense, I think, of lost time. I felt as though, first of all, I hadn't understood everything I'd just heard. And being an overconfident student at that time, I was angry at myself at that. Why was that, I wondered? Why were there so many provocative elements and reference in her talk that I hadn't understood, and why was that? But really above all, and this was the sum of it, why hadn't I heard this kind of talk before? And I was too young and unseasoned to know at that point how distinctive and unusual an experience that talk was. So I got hold of the book, and my delight and sense of challenge only grew with it, and it stayed with me over the years. I still try to read with my ears, as Avital advises in the book, and of course as the Romans always did with their habit of reading aloud. And in another passage I've returned to, which I had to go back and copy for you tonight, Avital writes, "Philosophy, love of wisdom, asserts a distance between love and wisdom. And in this gap that tenuously joins what it separates, we shall attempt to set up our cables." And these words resonate, of course, most directly for most of us with Plato, but also with Thucydides, with Cicero, with the satirist Persius and Augustine, some of the writers closest to my heart and mind. And I've read them differently over the years after reading this book. And the force of the ideas in here connects, at least in my view, the classicist with the Germanist, the philologist, the philosopher, the ancient with the modern. And Avital, I think, never makes those connections easy, but she does make them necessary. So these are very serious words so far. But the telephone book also reminded me, and I always tend a little too much towards earnestness, I'm afraid, but reminded me as a student and continues to remind me now of the central importance of experiment and play in thinking and in writing. So the Romans celebrated birthdays with poems. And with celebration and play in mind, I'm going to close by reading a pair of birthday poems that I've adapted from a tiny corpus belonging to one of the only extant Roman poets who is also a woman, and that's Sulpicia, the 1st century CE poet. And I've chosen her partly in celebration of different work that Avital has done, her work on Kathy Acker, whose Blood and Guts in High School, which blew my mind when I first came across it, also at college. It includes a brilliant adaptation of a contemporary of Sulpicia's, the poet Sextus Propertius. So to get this poem, you need to, but I don't need to advise brilliant literary critics and scholars in this room, but I'll just set the scene. You need to imagine the telephone book itself speaking to us. Okay, this is an adaptation of Sulpicia. My hateful birthday is here. Hateful, because I'm supposed to celebrate it all alone, to go away and leave my friends behind. But there's no place better than the city. In the country, it's boring and chilly. No place for a girl. Don't send me away. But the next poem in the pair seems to solve the book's problem. You know, that trip's been taken off my mind. I get to spend my day in the city. Let's spend the day together, as we hoped. We've had the good luck we were waiting for. Well, we're lucky to be together with the telephone book and its author tonight, so welcome again, and I wish you an exciting series of discussions. Thank you.
Before introducing our 4 panelists for our first session, I need to take the time to thank Robert Campbell, the Associate Director of CSGS, who has done so much behind the scenes and then in the room work making this 2-day symposium happen. I'm so grateful to work with him every day, and we are all very fortunate because we wouldn't be here in quite the way we are today without his labor. Also, big thanks to Juliana Camfield and to Sarah Gerner at Deutsches Haus. All been so wonderful to work with and so supportive of this project. Again, we would not be in this literal space without their support. So I just wanted to make sure that, actually, please join me in thanking the 3 of them. That would be terrific. And because you all have the program, and you can also go online to links to even larger sort of bibliographic information on our 4 speakers, I'm not going to give detailed introductions of them because the point is for us to have the luxury of time together to talk. So our first 4 presenters will speak in the order in which they're listed in the program. So we'll hear first from Emanuela Bianchi of NYU, and then Patricia Clough, who's at CUNY. Our next speaker is Mariano Lopez, a colleague at NYU Buenos Aires. And then finally, we'll hear from Fred Moten, who, a dear former colleague from NYU, now at UC Riverside. We're happy to welcome him back to NYU. Their prompt was basically to speak for around up to 18 minutes, and I'm going to set my phone, my new school phone, to go off in an old school way. We'll ring them out if need be. But the prompt, actually, to all the speakers was pretty broad. It was to play with, thumb through, operate, manipulate, listen to, sing with the telephone book in whatever mode appealed. So let's see what modes they've chosen, and then we'll be getting some choosing time at the end for plenty of discussion as well. So I'm going to turn the mic or podium wherever. I don't know if you want the mic to do it from there or come up here, but first we'll hear from Emma Bianchi of NYU.
Hi. First, I want to just thank Anne and Ben Kafka and Avital Ronell for including me in this event. I'm very, very honored to be speaking today. My paper is called The Telephone Book at 2500. Who or what is calling, and by what means? The circuits, broken, exploded, and multiplied, of call and response and mediation. These circuits which the telephone book traces and garbles with exquisite and unprecedented acuity. What kind of response can they elicit from us? For those of us inclined to pick up the long-distance call from classical antiquity, we've just heard from Joy, it is the dimension of reception, its possibility, its errancy, its urgency, its contemporaneity that emerges as a keynote. Why listen? Why respond? Why now? But how can telephony, with its late 19th century inception, its specific technological modalities and apparatuses, resound with this scene of textual engagement? We receive classical texts, it is true, mostly through a long game of telephone, of manuscript lineages copied from copies of copies, along with desultory fragments of papyrus. The famous obscurity of Pindar, the scraps of Sappho, the snippets of lost satyr plays, the stammerings, strainings, multiple paths of translation, disconnects, and drop calls. These sometimes amount to a standard of clarity that any New York subscriber to AT&T would thoroughly appreciate. And yet what we also receive is a vision of classical Greece, of glorious wholeness and of unimpeachable hegemony. The larger-than-life manhood of brave Achilles, shining forth with the Apollonian brilliance and clarity so well described by Nietzsche. We have the perfect flank of the Apollo Belvedere, likewise rapturously contoured by the 18th century Winckelmann, whose erotic invocations of Platonism invite us to transcend to a noetic realm of perfect, uninterrupted contemplation of form. There are many interfaces and mediations to consider here. In the context of Platonic eros, one might think immediately of Derrida's reading of the Phaedrus and Plato's designation of writing as pharmakon, an aid to memory and yet a substitutive danger to it, never able to measure up to the vivid presence of living speech. Ronell's telephone indeed converses intimately with Derrida's carte postale, the circuitry and insecurity of long-distance communication at stake in both the letter and the phone call. But although the telephone call deals in living speech, bridging the distance between caller and respondent in an instant, instantaneously, in the now of the present, and the written text may traverse eons of time, Ronell's attunement to the différance of mediation, its simultaneous differentiating in space and its deferrals in time, never stops marking the ways that the long distance, the tele of telephony, continually draws us into temporality, into the longue durée. The Ronellian telephone thus pulls us forward and backward, but mostly backward in time, back toward voices that come before us, the calls, ontological and psychical, that beset us, and especially to certain scenes of trauma, to the wounds and their proliferations and compensations Ronell so relentlessly interrogates in the history of philosophy, poetry, and psychoanalysis, and in the history of the telephone itself. Heidegger, whose calls both ontic and ontological, and whose own concern with technology frame the book, himself never stopped listening to Greek antiquity, and neither, for that matter, did Nietzsche. And since I'm up first today, by way of laying out the auditory territory, it is these two figures, both on Ronell's frequently called list, I'd like to spend a little time with, along with everybody's old friend and son Bob, Oedipus. The Heideggerian call, the Ruf, sets the scene. For the voiceless call of being, or the call of conscience, recalls us to what has, for Heidegger, been forgotten, at least since the congealings of ancient metaphysics, and that is the question of being, the question of being's coming to presence, and the sending or destining of being. Ronell's Augenblick, her lightning flash, or really the thunderbolt that sounds this lighting of being, is to bring this call of being at the level of ontology into crisis alongside the very specific call that came to Heidegger on the telephone at the University of Freiburg a week or so after he had assumed the rectorate in the spring of 1933. The call came from the Sturmabteilung, or Stormtrooper Bureau, requesting that Heidegger post the so-called Jew notice. In the 1966 interview with Der Spiegel, in which Heidegger is asked about the call, he attests that he refused, but as Ronell notes, quote, in itself, This will not mean that he did not accept the call, end quote. The question of Heidegger's involvement with National Socialism has, of course, been renewed with the publication in Germany of the Black Notebooks earlier this year, and no one could argue that during this period he demonstrated at the very least an inexcusable political naivete, if not outright collusion. But what Ronell draws our attention to is less his political will, or lack thereof, but rather his specific ignorance of, one might say blindness to, the particularity of his being placed, gestellt, by the technology of the telephone. In picking up the receiver, in responding, he's drawn in advance to a circuitry of political power in which his specific response, refusal or assent, is more or less moot. We might say along with Althusser that he's interpolated, and here interpolated by a complex of technology and power, working together to numb him to the structure of the call to which his philosophical orientation otherwise devotes him. And this crackling or cracking of the line never stops both frustrating and enabling the call of conscience, the call of being. The ontic crosses the ontological. The phone is not a technology like the airplane or the motorcycle, one whose standing reserve has been accumulated for our utility, consumption, and enjoyment. It is an instrument and prosthesis that outstrips us, to be sure, but one that always remains medial, jamming the boundary between self and others. It allows one to hear calls, facilitates our being with and against one another, while always haunting us from another place, rendering us guilty in advance and disconnecting us, cutting us up. This telephone inframes and deframes. A second Heideggerian eruption Ronell draws out is a moment in Was heißt denken, when he leads us to another scene, a maternal scene of calling and hearkening. Heidegger writes, quote, "You just wait, I'll teach you what we call obedience, gehorchen," a mother might say, ruft, to her boy who won't come home, end quote. While Heidegger's tropes of the house and of dwelling are legion, this familial scene of flight and return with respect to the mother is most unusual and performs for Ronell a rare connection to the Freudian switchboard of the Fort da. In the Fort da, the away there, the infant in his cot attempts to master the mother's absence through the game of sending away and drawing back the reel on a string or cord, her substitute. By contrast, in Heidegger's account, a fugitive and recalcitrant son is called back, called to tarry with and hearken to the mother. As Ronell says, quote, "The mother speaks to open the ears of the boy who won't come home," end quote. This maternal call that is placed via the wire of the umbilicus and yet is articulated in linguistic imperatives enacts a maternal superego, one that resounds through the pages of the telephone book, and whose performance makes of the boy an addict. Here, the ear, the passive organ of reception, invaginated, as she says, is linked by the telephonic logic to the mother's mouth and to the mother's womb. And now we have unequivocally arrived in Oedipal territory, in which the boy will accept no substitutes, no prostheses for the mother, but is riven to her despite himself. And as we know, Oedipus's rivenness to Jocasta is secured or occasioned not by her call exactly, nor by his conscious response, but rather by a prior call, a call from a yet more distant and obscure source, the call of the oracle at Delphi. 3 oracular pronouncements set Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos, first performed in 429 BCE, almost 2,500 years ago, in motion. The play opens with the chronologically latest, as Creon announces that the city's pollution, cause of its infertility, will be lifted when Laius' murder at the crossroads is avenged and the killer exiled. The first oracle of the story is that which tells Laius he's fated to be the victim at the hands of his son, and the second one is that which the young Oedipus seeks, the one that tells him he is fated to lie with his mother and to be the murderer of his father. What, though, are the lines of connection to these pronouncements that drive Oedipus's, and not only Oedipus's, fate? And who truly is speaking them? What can the telephone book teach us about their defiles and divagations? The murder of Laius takes place famously at the three-way crossroads between Thebes, Daulis, and Delphi. The line of fate connecting Delphi to Thebes may have gone in quite another direction, to Daulis, to yet another site of trauma, incest, and also cannibalism, the cut-out tongue of Philomela, her telegraphic transmissions through weaving, and her sister Procne's madness. That's a other story. This interrupted and crossed line is itself characteristic of the oracle, of which Heraclitus wrote, quote, "The Lord whose oracle is in Delphi neither speaks out, lege, nor conceals, crypte, but gives a sign, semine." Who speaks here? Who's calling? Phoebus Apollo is the designated author, and yet it is the priestess, the Pythia, who operates the switchboard, and from whose mouth issues the often garbled, schizophrenic, encrypted, yet signifying speech. The feminine presence here is not to be underestimated. The Delphic oracle, an omphalos or navel, and its noxious fumes emanating from the depths of the earth, over which the Pythia sat upon her tripod, was in earlier times sacred to Gaia herself. The umbilicus to the mother, usurped by shining Apollo, now transmitted through the Pythia, her avatar. Plutarch's De Pythiae Oraculis, written in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes the scene. Listen. Take and add then to what is here so well said, the conception that the god of this place employs the Pythia for the hearing, as the sun employs the moon for the seeing. He shows and reveals his own thoughts, but shows them mingled in their passage through a mortal body and a soul which cannot remain at rest or present itself to the exciting power, unexcited and inwardly composed, but which boils and surges and is involved in the stirrings and troublesome passions from within. As whirlpools do not keep a steady hold on bodies borne round and also downwards, since an outer force carries them round, but they sink down of their own nature, so that there is a compound spiral movement of a confused and distorted kind. Even so, what we call inspiration seems to be a mixture of two impulses, and the soul is stirred by two forces, one of which it is a passive recipient, one form its own nature. And that's the end of Plutarch's quote. Lest we miss the technological connection here in the scene of chthonic corporeal transmission, let us note that the tripod, the three-legged contraption upon which the Pythia sits, also has the distinction of being the first artifact designated as an automaton in Western literature in the canon. When in the Iliad Thetis visits Hephaestus in order to plead for a shield and armor for Achilles, she finds him at work fashioning golden-wheeled tripods which might, of themselves, automatoi, enter the gathering of the gods and then return to his house. The tripod is a technology that moves between. The threefold structure of the telephone developed by Ronell, connecting mouth to ear by hand, riven by a desire that issues from somewhere beyond, that is also within, always threatening noise and disconnection, runs through the oracular scene with startling clarity, like an electric current. As well as the psychoanalytic injunction to know thyself, in Plutarch's time another mysterious and provocative inscription was said to stand at the temple in Delphi, a lone letter E. Plutarch's own dialogic speculation upon the E at Delphi covers many interpretations. It is the fifth letter, and thus the number 5. It is the second vowel, and thus the second planet, the sun, meaning Apollo. The E sounded out in Greek phone is a, meaning if, or the second person singular of the verb to be, you are. Setting this telephonic polysemy aside for a moment, The most extraordinary element of this dialogue is that it's the site of the first explicit argument for a direct line connecting the gods Apollo and Dionysus, running between the shining god of individuation and visual acuity and the resounding rhythmic god of dissolution. Plutarch writes, "Then, if anyone asks, what is all this to Apollo? Much we will answer, not to Apollo only, but also to Dionysus, who has no less to do with Delphi than has Apollo. Now we hear theologians saying or singing in poems or in plain prose that the god subsists indestructible and eternal, and that by force of some appointed plan and method, he passes through changes of his person. At one time he sets fire to nature, and so makes all like unto all. At another, passes through all phases of difference, shapes, sufferings, powers. At the present time, for instance, he becomes Cosmos, and that is his most familiar name. The wiser people disguise from the vulgar the change into fire and call him Apollo from his isolation, and that's Plutarch's play on words because Apollo, it's the privative and the many, so they call him Apollo from his isolation. Phoebus from his undefiled purity. As for his passage and distribution into waves and water and earth and stars and nascent plants and animals, they hint at the actual change undergone as a rending and dismemberment, but name the god himself Dionysus or Zagreus or Nyctalius or Isidaites. Deaths too and vanishings do they construct, passages out of life and new births, all riddles and tales to match the changes mentioned. So they sing to Dionysus dithyrambic strains, charged with sufferings, and a change wherein are wanderings and dismemberment. And that's the end of the quote from Plutarch. The link between opsis and phone, between sight and sound, between a wholeness and polysemic dismemberment, recalls the violent divestiture of Marbell into the baby bells, recounted by Ronell in a striking footnote that quotes a pamphlet of 1985 called Breaking the Connection, A Short History of AT&T. Quote, "That word, divestiture, seems inadequate as a description of a many-limbed giant ripping off limb after limb, flinging the pieces in all directions, and leaving the landscape littered with big bleeding hunks of its former self." I've got 6 more lines. Oh, you're good. Okay. The bell that comes just after. The Ronellian telephone thus hangs all about this oracle. The destining of being, the ontic umbilicus to the specific mother, the polysemic scrambling of language, the traumatic dismemberment of the body into pieces, Apollo transformed into Dionysus, the voice emanating from beyond, from the depths of the earth, through the schizophrenic speech of the switchboard. The E itself, heard along these lines, now appears in another significance. The 3-pronged letter emerges as such via the telephone book, earpiece, mouthpiece, and chord, a persistence of the signifier, a topology, a phonology, and an obstruction to which we can never stop listening. Thanks.
Hi. Certainly, I too want to thank Anne and Ben and Avital for inviting me. I'm more than thrilled to be here. And Robert, it's Robert, right? And Robert. To make a telephone call is to become an element adjoined to a vast network of more or less effectively coordinated and stabilized actors, from billing practices of service providers through routers, switches, telecommunication protocol, satellite dishes, and the balance of geopolitical forces down to knowing the modus operandi of successful forms of communication and address. This is how Matthew Fuller and Andrew Goffey put it when taking a telephone call as an example of both the networks of our socio-technical infrastructure and the socio-technical sensibility with which actors act within these infrastructural networks, or what Fuller and Goffey call the gray zone, or the gray media, enlarging our view of media studies to include stratagems from systems administration to data gathering and dissemination, neither simply mass media nor social media. As a sociologist long interested in media, Fuller and Goffey's work threw me back to my own desire to write about sociological method as media and media as socio-technical infrastructure. In my first book, The Ends of Ethnography, this meant to treat sociological method by deploying critical literary studies, deconstruction, and the like. But as I approach writing my third book, my desire to treat sociological method as media was given the tentative title, The Television Book, inspired by none other than the telephone book, not only for its rich treatment of technology, but also, or maybe especially, for its formal experimentation. The television book became autoaffection, the unconscious in the age of teletechnology, falling short of the book that inspired it, precisely because I could not execute a formal innovation as Avital had so brilliantly done. But in autoaffection, a last bit of my desire to innovate form appears as a prose poem called Television, a Sacred Machine, where I not only address the television and take seriously the presence of the technological in thinking or thought, I also make present the unconscious functioning of desire in the technical frame of the presentation of data. I would like to read the prose poem with some cuts due to time. I read it in honor of what remains an inspiration to me, Avital's telephone book. Television, a Sacred Machine. The title is meant to trick you. It is meant to keep you from being afraid of me, because I'm drawn to the machine, because I'm drawn in by the machine that draws me out, that draws me apart. I'm afraid that you will see that it excites me, being drawn out, being drawn apart, being drawn out into parts. It is an apparatus of display, the machine. It holds me on display, holds me to the display. I am afraid you will be afraid when you see what comforts me. It is a holding apparatus, the machine. It holds me up, cradles me. It is made of framing devices that negate, reverse, and enlarge, to perfect and protect. It makes me an ideal surface of projection and reception. Is it already getting too difficult for you? But you said you wanted to understand what I was saying. I'm not saying. I am desiring. The machine. I am the machine's desire. The desiring machine alone knows my desire. It keeps it. It repeats it. In the machining of my desire, I am not located. I am held and beheld. Would it be easier if I said, in postmodernity, increasingly control is applied to people's routine existence by the apparatuses of education and entertainment which exact identification and consensus? It would be easier, but it would be different. This is not only about ideology, about arrested and arresting political positions, nor is it only about self-exposure, an autobiographical antidote for a closeted, all-knowing I. My machine has more parts. It has more action, like the action of fingertips attached to ivory keys, playing in between the beats of a metronome's patterning. My first piano came from my grandparents' house. A barreled organ, it became a street piano as it transmigrated from Brooklyn to Queens to the 3-room apartment where I lived and where it was placed up against a wall. From there, it beckoned me, gently at first, but then more and more insistently. It was an upright, and when being played, the wooden covering over the strings and hammer devices was to be left slightly ajar. It was for better sound, but it also was an exposure. I could see the machine's action. I could see the strip of red felt ribboning through the strings. I could see the hammer devices, which, when moving, seemed like marching toys, not so friendly, but regular and regulating. And there were the keys, meeting the eye, meeting the fingers all at once, as the wooden hood over the keyboard was slid back into the piano's insides. If I were very still, the piano would grab me by the fingertips. It would speed me up, slow me down, take me high, take me low. The piano bench would gently support my body's flight into a trance of mobile immobility. This is not simply sex. I fear that in your ear my words are already simply sex, a child becoming piano, a body becoming machine. Not yet a sex. It is desiring 1,000 tiny sexes in between the keys, in the action of the hammering devices, in the strings. Those wrapped thinly for startling and stinging vibration, those more heavily wrapped for somber and sobbing sounds. Not yet a sex, I tell you. It is that the eye of the piano is down below me, looking up from where my feet attach to the pedals. It sees into and through the indifferent spacing between piano and piano bench, backs of knees and elbows, bits of arm and slices of thigh are cut out by the piano's vision. It is not yet a sex, this vision from below shooting up into me. It is not because it is sex that it excites me. It is that I cannot see myself like the piano sees me. Its eye is the eye of the outside. It has its own eye. The piano lives, and it gives its music to me. Would it all make more sense if I reminded you that sociologists say that by the early 1960s, the television had replaced the piano that was once in every lower middle class family, an object of entertainment and a mark of upward mobility? I would have told you that right from the start, but by the early 1960s, I was already gone from my home, in flight, a musical organ, a sacred machine. Actually, it was before the early 1960s that I first took flight from my home. It was in the 1950s when I had my first piano lesson. I was 6. My teacher, Sister Mary Bernadine, met me at the back door of the convent. Following her, I passed a long row of wooden rockers up against the porch wall. Suddenly, we were inside. I was told to walk on my tippy toes, to be quiet, as she led me through the refectory. The air pressed its lightness heavily against my young body. I felt faint with the pleasure of the secret life I was glimpsing there. We moved quickly down a long hall to a small room with a piano up against the wall. The piano was much like mine at home, but it seemed much more tired and somehow proud. Sitting before it and next to Sister Mary Bernadine, my back was up against a wall. There was no room in that room that wasn't taken up with the music-making machine. The lesson began with Sister Mary Bernadine holding my 10 fingers between her 2 hands, saying, "Don't just play it, pray it." I wanted to think, but I couldn't, that I was an anointed one, destined. But thinking that I wasn't worthy was a way of being I already knew at 6. Still, I was destined by that piano, destined to find myself in attachment to machines, to find comfort in difficult compositions of sounds and images, drawn less to meanings and more to ordered angles, corners of frames, coordinates of moving surfaces, drawn to the machine, drawn in desire to the machine of desire. I am certain that it would have been easier if I had said, television is part of the way in which exchange value is constructed, distributed, and attached to bodies formed in the general circulation of labor, commodities, and money. It has expanded the zones of value by changing, mediating, that is to say, mechanizing the imaginary of social relations. It would have been easier, but different. This is not only about an economy of value attached to exchange between body and machine. It is about the attachment itself. It is about the tacking devices that put up the display, the framing devices that are given to hold and behold. It is to wonder about their location and the micro movement of the singular forces of music accompanying the machine's vision. Ah, the wonder of it. To wonder how it is that the machine's vision is not secondary to my vision, an auto-television, a flickering up and a passing away of conscious contact, zapping in and out of a rush of images and sounds. A mother who only loves just enough, not quite the wire mummy of the rhesus monkey experiments of an earlier scientific research agenda, the cold machine. A mother's sensual singing accompanied by a red and white kitchen radio, the tantalizing machine, the fat of a childhood body that would be without organs, without a sex, all filled up, all closed in, the numbing machine. A World War II father, needy, limited, and unfaithful, shot in his army fatigues late in the afternoon with a Brownie camera, the war machine. A father's lap, like a couch to sink into while he reads nursery rhymes, the influencing machine. A 1939 photograph of a bride and groom, young, handsome, red lips and white gardenias. I remember Mama. Make room for Daddy. Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. Holding my face up close, touching the screen, hard but never too hot, just cool enough. Stories of techno-organic kinships, stories that cannot be passed on only as history. The singularities of a life, which when mined for their richness, should not be made to encourage a swapping of memories, a textual game of, oh, that happened to me too, that stalls the movement of chance, disarms pivots of unpredictable necessity in the relations of bodies and machines. Thank you.
I want to thank Ben and Robert and Avital and Anne for this invitation. I'm deeply honored and happy to be here, nervous as well. Sorry for that. So let me begin by recalling that this evening we are not necessarily honoring a person or a proper name, but a book, which is there. In fact, we are honoring an event which, as such, cannot be contained by any conventional idea of authorship. Let's remember and repeat that the telephone book was not written by a single person, but by a multitude. In the telephone book, Avital dissolves authorship and descends or ascends to the condition of operator. As we all know, Avital's texts have often toyed with this possibility. Besides working as operator, she has been secretary, translator, commentator, medium, and has devoted her entire book to the predicament of the person who takes notes and follows dictations. Celebrating or affirming the dissemination of the author, she constantly praises these actors and actresses that have, to all appearances, been casted for a supporting role. Tonight, I will wear one of these masks and speak mostly as translator, as somebody committed to the task of translating her words into Spanish. This task involved, first of all, learning to read in a certain way, and this is the first commandment of the telephone book. Learn how to read with your ears. The telephone book teaches us that we have to listen to the text we work with, especially to what is less audible than them. It is a book that holds the receiver close to the fragments it has welcomed, as if trying to amplify the voice. In other words, the operator in charge reads and writes with attentive ears, making space for the nuances and the tiny details that usually remain unheard. The typographic arrangements in the telephone book are in this sense central. They make the different fragments scream, shout, whisper, or stammer. It is as though Avital had been working the night shift, as a text jockey of sorts, giving graphic expression to the different volumes, beats, and rhythms. In this, she's honoring the telephone, which as a concept was all about letting the others speak. In its use of quotes, pauses, silences, and typography, the telephone book creates a rhythm, a tone, its own voice, a voice that nonetheless is not personal. If anything, it has multiple personality disorder. Thus, the relationship the telephone book has with its text and objects is always already haunted and polluted by the voices of others, Derrida, Freud, Heidegger, you name it. In this sense, in Avital's sense, close reading works as illustration and affirmation of the ontological character of Mitsein. The telephone book pays special attention to the modalities of the phone's public presentation. You may remember the telephone was first presented in the context of vaudeville, in a proto-spectacular mixture between séance, dissimulation, music concert, magic show, scientific display, operating theater. Even singing was involved. The telephone book recreates some of this primitive spectacle. It works as vaudeville itself. And in this conference, we will be honoring this commitment to choral work and cohabitation of genres, which constitutes an ethics. For my part, let me have pop music in the background. Pop has always been in a torrid affair with the telephone. It has often celebrated the amplifying and connecting powers of Pell's Child. I Just Called to Say I Love You or Call Me by Blondie. In these songs, the telephone works as its ancestor, the magic wand or the magic flute, and multiplies the love and the opportunities for fusion. However, I am mostly intrigued by the songs that play the airwaves, and now YouTube with references to the non-reliability of the apparatus. These are odes to miscommunication, to what in the telephone disconnects and interferes. They reveal a fear of technology as something constitutively destabilizing or threatening. These are some examples. And they remind me of the first response I got when I was trying to translate and publish the telephone book. Here I have another one. I wish Avital was wearing this at some point. It seems a beautiful headset. And then pay attention to the lyrics. It's about like not being able to communicate, actually. So it was 2008. Yes, it's brilliant. Also, like the first page of I don't have the book here now, but just this typographic decision of having the E's in telephone multiplied like this here. So I think Gaga read the telephone book probably. So I was talking about my project to translate the telephone book. It was 2008. I had just returned to Buenos Aires. And of course, I needed to establish a secure line to Avital and to explore a way of dumbing the trauma of separation. And then I decided I would devote myself to translate her text into Spanish. At the moment I was back, I contacted a publisher I knew and thought he was going to be receptive because he was pretty smart. He had studied at La Sorbonne. So I said, okay, this guy is going to understand and welcome this book. And then I basically gave him the book. He read it. He was like excited, but then he came back and said, well, I mean, this is brilliant, but I don't know because we are in 2008 and this book was written in 1989. I was disgusted by the short-sightedness and sheer stupidity of the comment, but I decided to stay in the line and I offered him a second text, which was the test drive, and we published it as Pulsión de Prueba. This was the translation I did of the test drive. But I'm kind of intrigued by this rejection because it was traumatic to me as well. So I wanted to think about it a little bit. To begin with, of course, let's not forget this is a threatening book, an irritating book, that dares to deal with a metaphysical object that many will consider not worthy of philosophy or thinking. But also in his rejection, there seems to be also resistance to the so-called past, aka 1989. A certain fear structure at work that I think is worth exploring. Let me say, together with Avital, Abraham, Torok, and others, that something may have been encrypted in 1989. We all know that what this year meant for Western and world history. It was a year of the fall of the wall. For some people, this was a moment of hope, pregnant with futurity. But for others, this meant the traumatic and definitive arrival of the so-called end of history. Let me put you on hold while we reflect on the simultaneity of the telephone book and the fall of the wall. The fall of the wall was perceived as a moment of reconnection, a moment in which a state, Germany, was casting a net of connectedness that extended to the world, which was no longer to be divided in two separate and opposing blocks. Historically, on the other hand, the erection of a telephone system, the telephone book explains, means that the telephone was connecting where there had been little or no relation, that it globalized and unified, suturing a country like a Bund. It participated in the pathos of his father Bell, the pathos of regathering and binding. Thus, the fall of the wall, like the telephone, participated in and helped recreate myth of organic unity. Of course, as a telephone book was alerting us, coming from the future as it was, this reconnection, this binding, this suturing was not going to be exempt of problems, anxieties, and traumatic events. In Latin America, and as one of the echoes of this uncanny world reconnection, 1989 marked the initiation of a new modern period, the onset of a traumatic modernization. And interestingly, this modernization had the telephone as one of its lines of advance. In most Latin American countries, telephone companies were to that date managed by the government as part of a notion of big government spending associated with a model of welfare state capitalism. In 1989, suddenly this was the past. Telecommunications and other services needed to undergo modernization. This is privatization, the dismemberment of the national government-controlled telephone companies, which were sold to French, Spanish, and North American capitals that would manage them more efficiently, was felt both as a strong wind of fresh air and as a traumatic event. This marked, in any way, the opening of a new era, of our future, and of what in the telephone book, glossing Rilke, is called Americanism. Now they are intruding from America, empty, indifferent things, sham things, damage of life. Rilke interprets modernization along the lines of the plague of Americanism, which Antonio Gramsci and others sense and theorize as historical phenomenon, and which we can update now as the plague of the neoliberal global hegemony. The empty things, like the new American and French telephones in Latin America, were emptied of their rootedness in the past and of the human trait that used to partake of things. As has been proved over and over, modernization, the advent of modern technology, here, the streamlining of the telephone companies implied unemployment for a lot of workers. And as the telephone book reminds us, it also implied unemployment for pre-technological concepts. Maybe this is what the publisher heard in 1989. It was a blast from the past that had installed a traumatic future. In that sense, we may say that he did get the call, and he was reacting to the stubborn vitality of that traumatic year, still very much alive today, even in pop music. This is the current #1 album in America today, 1999. And yes, actually, he was like, Avital herself has a beautiful moment in the telephone book when she recalculates the reach of the term moment, when she says that Nazism may have been the worst moment in the history of technology, but of course, as a moment, it's still open, not closed or finished, okay? But now I have to interrupt this. I'm sorry, because I have another call. Because when this guy said that we were not going to translate the telephone book, I basically had like a manic reaction and started to try to translate everything by Avital, you know? So I just finished translating Crack Wars, which will be published next year, and hopefully Avital will come to Buenos Aires to present it. And I also prepared and selected some essays to prepare this volume, which is called Reinas de la Noche in Spanish. And one of the essays in Reinas de la Noche is actually in conference call with the telephone book. It's called The Worst Neighborhoods of the Real. And it was published in the feminist journal Differences in 1989. I thought it was important to have at least a fraction or a cell of the telephone book in Spanish, and this is why I decided to include this essay. But I mean, here I'm not trying to brag about my accomplishments. It's just that the episode with the publisher made me hypersensitive to misunderstandings. And there is misunderstandings, sorry. And there is a passage in Los Peores Barrios de lo Real that I still find a little obscure in the text by Avital. So I was thinking maybe you can help me here, because there's, I mean, I did translate it okay, but I still don't understand what you mean, basically. So it goes like this.
What do you mean you didn't understand what I mean?
Well, exactly what you hear.
You're in trouble.
Okay. So, I will read. Pero el lenguaje, de acuerdo con Foucault, no puede crear para sí mismo una zona de inmunidad radical. Constantemente corre el riesgo de ser expuesto, y es precisamente en este encuentro entre el cuerpo del lenguaje y sus anticuerpos, el encuentro del lenguaje de la desviación y el del normativismo prescriptivo, que el lenguaje de Foucault está en peligro de contaminación severa. Did you understand?
I think you got it right.
I knew. You want to comment on this?
Sure, hay muchos Foucault. Okay.
We knew that already.
Okay, thank you. No, so, you know, at the time I was transmitting from a bunker in Berkeley. And Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley, had territorialized and used Foucault in certain ways, sanitized him, made him, cleaned up his act. And I was trying to show that this was a kind of major sanitation department, Berkeley, that should not be proud of its ability to clean up the deviancy in Foucault, and therefore, am I answering your question?
Yeah, totally.
So that Foucault's body should not be thrown out of the consideration of what happened to Foucault's text, how it was immunologically, pathologically kind of cleaned up all the time. To talk with you, to speak with you in terms of a kind of cryptonomy of not being able to deal with AIDS in a certain way. So he was always exposed to a cleanup job, and his language was also purified in certain ways. At Berkeley, I thought. My great colleague and friend Fred was at Berkeley with me. I don't know if you agree with the kind of uber cleanliness that Foucault was subjected to. So I tried in my way to show that the deviance, I think, was what was being eliminated and suspended. Am I done here?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, does this count as part of discussion? And then we have like, okay. So thank you. Now I got it, really. In this essay, then, as she just explained, Avital is listening to Foucault. Legend says Foucault was his first teacher. I don't see how this is possible. You can't be over 30 or 35, but I mean, I also know you're like Mozart. Maybe you took his class when you were 5 or something. So anyway, as she was explaining, the name of Foucault is index of yet another battle she was fighting and still fighting, the need for philosophy and thought to risk contamination, to commit themselves to transgression and an intimacy with what was not their territory, to hang out, in other words, in the worst neighborhoods of the real, to become a corner boy or girl and deal in dangerous substances. I think it is important to stress this, especially because, as the telephone book shows, science and philosophy and academia in general tend to resist contamination, to erect barriers and borders. Avital, on the contrary, takes note from the telephone, aim at breaking out of carcerating structures. Here we see Avital in jail. It was a really difficult moment, but already doing these headsets that, we all know her for. Impersonating the telephone, Avital commits her thought to contamination. So she talks about things that in 1989 and today seem scandalous and irritating, threatening: AIDS, the telephone, Gerede. And last but not least, about something that is always connected to Garrede, biography. Let me put an end to the life of my presentation by recalling that the telephone book produces a new type of reading of biography. We come to understand the conditions of possibility of the telephone, or we reconstruct the calls the telephone was and is responding to. Thus, we read about Bell's brothers, parents, wife, cats, and catastrophes. And gracefully, we arrive at the end of the book, which is really moving and actually moved me to tears last time I was reading it. The book walks us through the last moments of Alexander Graham Bell's life. We read that to the very end, he cannot sever his connection to his dead brother. We read that to the very end, he will not abandon his wife, not even in his deathbed. When she cries, "Don't leave me," he types "no" on her hand with his fingertips. And Avital offers, quote, "AGB could not tolerate separation. The departure of the other, his inseparability, was a point of radical resistance," end of quote. It is possible that this scene has moved me to tears due to an unchecked tendency to identify with Bell. Me, I cannot tolerate separation, I cannot tolerate the departure of the other, or my departure. It is a point of radical resistance. And it's safe to say it is this resistance what has been telecommanding my commitment to the mission popularly known as the task of the translator. Thank you.
I brought something to show and tell and to hand around, something for you to lay your hands on. The copy of the telephone book that Avital signed for me 24 years ago today. Her inscription reads, "For Fred and all the close calls we were meant to have." Admiringly, Avital Ronell, October 30th, 1990, Berkeley. At first glance, it will appear as if we missed each other, as if we missed just missing each other, as if articulation's asymptotic brush just missed us. But an encountering was already occurring, had already come on the line. A three-way conference call spurred by my big brother, which is to say that I am his big double, Akira Lipid, who's here right now, even though he isn't here right now. Here and being just a phone call away. Avital had already been taking care of me in Berkeley, the capital of carelessness. I was in a different department, the English department, the department of a kind of literary study that was beneath comparison, insofar as it always thought itself to be above comparison. The space between Wheeler and Ronell wasn't untraversable, but to feel the transversal, to enact the reverse, you had to be smuggled. You had to be carried while also being welcomed. Who is it? Or deeper still, what is it? What is the mechanism? What is the function that can not only carry and welcome, but also, and at the same distended time, release? The mother calls her boy away. Always one last throw into the community sing. In the last real conversation I kept having with my mom, she had come to New York to hear me read. It was a raucous, New York schoolish, Black Mountainous kind of thing. And she had been so particularly impressed by a poem about masturbation that she looked at me and said, "I'm gonna have to let you go." I was 37. A few days later, she died on her 66th birthday. Let me go where, Mama? Let me go to whom? I wish I could call her right now so she could tell me, but she already told me. She's telling me right now. She began letting me go the instant she began to carry me, the instant she began to bid me welcome, telling the world it was welcome to me, holding me in her hands, holding me out, handing me. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a mama's boy. They are responsible for me, and so they have to take responsibility for me. It's embarrassing to talk about myself when I should be talking about Avital, her address, her call, the severe discipline of her anti-disciplinary, anti-dissertational directory assistants. But I'm incapable of that separation in the infinitesimal but unbridgeable distance between us, our inseparable distance and difference from one another, our ongoing near miss, our incessant close call. I know it's a little strange in being too unestranged, a little too close for comfort. It's not easy. I'm uneasy about it. Surely we all have to feel a bit uneasy. My embarrassment is pregnancy's false friend, but I am full with and full of something other than myself, having been made responsible for carrying this other thing around, having been made responsible by having serially been carried and lovingly handed on. I'm deeply, incalculably embarrassed, but I'm not ashamed. With regard to this embarrassment, I have no conscience, am not a coward, have not been rendered subject. The call I keep trying to answer bespeaks the infusion, the insistently previous insemination of the politics of technological modernity with the sociality of eco-technographic maternity. It's another type, an uncertain type of call of conscience, an imperative to answer, and so to acknowledge an irregular kind of hard rock catastrophic fluidity, drowning out the telephonic connection to the paternal belly of the state, an unumbilically radical incontinence, the thing of darkness in its submarine feel, the black thing, because the impossible mother is always black, because blackness is impossible maternity, is the shadow whisper in your ear that comps every call, like Glenn Gould humming through the interplay of practice and performance and mechanical reproduction, both to drown out and replicate the substitutive maternal hum of unaligned and impossible domestic service. The incessant substitution that comprises the maternal ecology, what it is continually to be handed, as Hortense Spillers would say, the fugitive seriality of maternal lesson and lesion, of the edapedagogical set or jam, the jammed lines of the ongoing maternal lecture. I have been continually introduced to and in this fold and broken circle by Spillers, by Toni Morrison, and more immediately in a more hands-on modality of being handed by B. Jenkins and Avital Ronell. It makes me want to fill Deutsches house up with country music. Mama tried. I heard the sound of my dear old mama crying. My baby goes from hand to hand. Merle Haggard, George Jones, and Lefty Frizzell opening for Craig Mack to come put some flavor in your ear. All that is just to say that I never have been and never will be either willing or able to separate myself from this paragraph, which is on page 24 of the telephone book. In this light, one of the things that we shall need to ponder concerns a tranquil assertion such as one finds in Being and Time. Quote, being towards others is ontologically different from being towards things which are present at hand, end quote. While this articulation involves a complex series of designations whose elaborations would require a patient tapping of each term, being towards, present at hand, it nonetheless must be seen to assume a clean ontological separation of others and things, wherein the other, as Heidegger states in the same passage, would be a duplicate of the self. The question that we raise before any approach can be made toward this passage, or the locality of the other, suggests a disposition other than the one disclosed in Heidegger's assertion. The mood we wish to establish is not one of reactivity, but of genuine wonder and bewilderment before the statement. At first sight, the statement asserts itself as constitutively unproblematic. Being towards others is ontologically different from being towards things which are present at hand. What is supposed, however, regards not only the difference between modes of being towards, but the aim or destination which would know the gap separating others from things. Now, what if others were encapsulated in things, in a way that being towards things were not ontologically severable, in Heidegger's terms, from being towards others? What if the mode of Dasein of others were to dwell in things, and so forth? In the same light, then, what if the thing were a doublet of the self, and not what is called other? Or, more radically still, what if the self were in some fundamental way becoming a Xerox copy, a duplicate of the thing in its assumed essence? This perspective may duplicate a movement in Freud's reading of the uncanny, and the confusion whirling about Olympia as regards her thingness. Perhaps this might be borne in mind as both Freud and Heidegger situate arguments on the other's thingification within a notion of Unheimlichkeit, the primordial being not at home, and of doublings. The primordial being not at home, the para-ontological difference, is our animaterial, animaternal home in homelessness. Being present at one another's hands and ears and mouths, we strive to be held and handed and kissed goodbye. We strive to disappear into anaxeroxic nothingness, to be at unease in the general and generative unease of social call, social rub, social hum, social social moi, social music. Our mother tongue is music discomposed. Like Stanley Cavell and everybody else, music is my mother's mother tongue, which Avital still teaches me to speak in irregular, irreducible impersonation of all the mothers who have ever carried me and handed me and given me their sign. I'm sorry I've had to get so personal, but Avital, will you sign your undrownable book again?
First, I want to thank all four presenters for such just beautiful words. And we have the real luxury now of, as we hoped, of time actually to talk and think together. And just, I mean, one thing I just want to say, just a few observations. I was so struck by the provocative questions that Fred asked at the end. What does it mean to let go as an act of welcome, to be handed over to the world? And it seems to me that that actually links up in some really interesting ways with questions and provocations in the other presentations. And I'm thinking that, all right, just a few associations, right? I hope that this can help. All right, there's a moment in civilization as discontents, which Avital talks about in the telephone book, and Freud sort of ventriloquizing sort of the depressed spirit of modernity, what losses civilization has brought us. And so, you know, that, well, my child has gone away, but at least I can hear my child's voice in the telephone, and yet my child has gone away. This technology that will bring the child close, at least the voice of the child will come close, has been made possible by another technology, that of the train, who's taken the child far from me. So the conundrum of the telephone, it closes down space that has been opened up at the same time by the other traumatic breakthroughs of modernity, the other technologies of communication, of which the train and the telephone are sort of, in some sense, conjoined twins. And so how do we think about that? But it's also a fantasy that the parent has of bringing the child home and close back, whereas Fred gave us a different kind of wish, which is that, no, I must let you go to the world. I must, in fact, miss you. A missing that is a having in a particular way. And so maybe the maternal wish Fred posed it as, very quite different, I think, than the paternal wish that Freud gives us in his active ventriloquism. But it makes me then think that back to the piano lesson that Patricia talked about. If the phone can, in fact, break through the desolation of home, and this quote that Mariano gave us, the desolation of home is a desolation that that cuts many ways, right? That might in fact be necessary to leave home. Patricia left home to the piano lessons. She talks about the keys, meeting the eye, meeting the fingertips. What does it mean to put the I in iPhone in this moment? But the piano strings, they're wrapped, they're tapped for vibration, which brought me to another string, the string of Fort Da. The little game the boy plays of Fort Da, the string tossed, you know, the focus is on the toy that disappears from sight, but actually the string connects. And I think about the homemade phones that children made before they were given those little, now the thing I've got down there, right? And children get phones a lot earlier to play with, but we used to make our own phones, right? The string. But what was so interesting in her presentation, Emma goes from Fort Da to the umbilical cord of Oedipus, but to talk about a maternal cord. And so maybe we should talk about the Fort Ma, right? And that, you know, the Fort Ma bell broken up, and how do we talk about those particular decompositions. Anyway, these are some of the sort of associations I was having across these beautiful presentations. And let us all be the machine's desire, and let the machine point us in all sorts of directions that might be missed connections of the most desirable kind.
thank you everyone for taking this call. I'm blown away. I was sent here as an envoy for the apparatus that produced the so-called telephone book. And I have to say that at the time, I really was kind of down and out. It wasn't self-understood that one could make such a book or break out of certain kinds of carceral silence that the institution signs off on, and you're in a certain kind of lockdown all the time. But then I ran into someone whom Peter Fenves called the most important publishing phenomenon in America. That's Bill Regier, who offered me shelter and a kind of free pass to do certain things. Derrida pointed out that it was very important. I'm speaking for the one who was operating at the time. I can't reappropriate that position. I'm just been volunteered, as you saw. So Derrida thought it was very important to decide on going with a university press and do something to re-signify and break up the serenity and the serene closure of the book as the university values it and seals it, and seals very important deals. They're magnificent books, don't get me wrong, but the desire and commitment to breaking up the book and its metaphysically laden pitch for closural sovereignty was something that was very important in all sorts of ways that you probably can hardly imagine, because the telephone also meant inviting the improper, hosting linguistic pollutants, opening up to the streets, getting splashed with what Heidegger disdains as Gerede and dirty talk and things that can't be really justified or dignified in a certain way. I can't tell if I was acting out. It was the moment that I got tenure that I said, well, I'll show those fuckers. So is this the way you're supposed to love your book? You know, is that? They'll see. And every page, which is differently designed by Richard Eckersley, every page was dedicated to whom I was going to make throw up by it. Yeah. I don't know. I'm a bit of an abusive mother, of course. I appreciate the maternalized calls, and but you don't want that from me. Let me tell you. So I don't know. I mean, I'm in the sense that Benjamin has educated me. I go by the rights of nerves, which is to say what pisses you off, what's intolerable, what's hurtful, what fucks you up. You're going to get it. You're going to let it not defeat you. You're going to go after it in a certain street way. So the other thing was I really was gunning for Heidegger, my teacher, in a sense, and very perplexed and mesmerized, fascinated by Derrida's insistence that we can't bypass Heidegger. That felt bad, but it felt like part of the Marine camp, the kind of boot camp training that I subjected myself to. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in or say something. I'm beyond immeasurably speechless to what I've heard, and I will report it to the operator who's in charge of some of this work. Again, in a Deleuzian way, the joy of making trouble, which I think is a woman's task and assignment, to make trouble, to stir trouble, and to stay on that kind of energy level where possible. You really do donate your body, though, when you're making trouble. You get slapped around, lots of smackdowns, lots of depreciations, and your domestic approval ratings. All right, enough about me. So anyway, where was I going with, did anyone follow this? There was a logic. So do you know where I'm going? Deleuzian way, thank you, where you want to be part of an ensemble, a brigade, a gangster kind of attitude, and I'm not pretending I can reappropriate that, but I am wanting that. That is a desire, no doubt about it. When I was an immigrant and came to this country, I was considered the boss girl in a little gang of delinquents. Not proud of it, but I'm trying to be true to it in certain ways. So that was provided to me by the University of Nebraska Press, who also took a chance on Blanchot and other not so well known as I am people like Derrida. Did you publish with Nebraska? I don't know why I think that Sylvia did. I have you in there as well. In any case, this was maybe the way of trying to build a collectivity and to try to get out of the carceral silence that and schizophrenic squeeze that writing usually implies. It's all a fantasy, so don't take it too seriously. You are alone, and no one's going to help you. Any questions? I told you I wasn't a good mother.
I'm memorizing that for office hours.
Oh, good luck. Yeah, right. No, they know that. Anyone wants to sing, dance, make a comment?
I just want to resort to personal recollection and remember when Avital came to NYU, and I was part of the promotion and tenure committee. And lo and behold, Avital's case comes up, and there were 6 of us, 2 people in the humanities, 2 in the sciences, and 2 in the social sciences. And it was very clearly just a formality, I thought, but lo and behold, it was not the case, because, and it was all around the telephone book, because one of the committee members in the social sciences said, now, wait a minute, I have a question here. I have a serious problem with this book, because this person is a comparatist, but what is she comparing? The telephone book, is she comparing names and telephone in the telephone book? And I started out trying to be very patient and not blowing up, and said, well, you know, so-and-so comparative literature is not necessarily about comparing A to B. It's a way of establishing relations, but it's not. Oh, but then why is it called? Well, we got into a huge argument. This person knew nothing about literature, but was just stuck on the word comparative. And then I felt I would resort to what seemed to me the most effective argument here. And I said, look, so-and-so, if we do not approve Avital Ronell's tenure, we're going to be the laughing stock of the whole profession. And, oh, you mean it would make us look bad? She's that important, said he. And I said, yes, more important than you even can imagine. And voila.
So you see the positing power of language and Nietzschean masks and fictions. That's wonderful. Thank you. I didn't know I was in trouble.
I wanted to ask, actually, and anyone in the panel can respond to this, but first, though, I direct it to Mariano, and this actually has to do with the format of the book. I mean, one of the things it's a gorgeous object, right? I mean, and it is actually, in that sense, beyond compare in a certain way, and it cannot be reproduced in the modes of reproduction that university presses and certainly trade presses want to utilize now, which is as an ebook. Because you can't actually do, an ebook has to be something that can be adjusted by the consumer. It has to be a standardized sort of file that the consumer can then adjust to the font size that he or she prefers. This book won't fit that kind of manipulation of the ebook. And I'm just sort of wondering is it possible that some of the resistance to the Spanish language publication was that it like how to figure out marketing? Because this book is, it's so fascinating because it's actually about the prostheses of techno-modernity, but it resists one of the major new prosthetics of techno-modernity. And that's part of, to me, its singularity and its beauty. But I'm just wondering if is that part of the problem potentially?
That was also actually mentioned because when he said 1989, I was like, my face was like, I don't know what it was, but like Picasso drawing or something. So he then like also said, well, there's also the issue of typography and color, and we can't do this here. And so again, then the book was not all but new because we had not the technology to do that in Argentina. So yes, it was totally part of that. And I think it's also part of why the book is so special to everybody that has it. I think it was with you, and that I asked, do you have, because I was working on this presentation in Buenos Aires, and I was like going everywhere with the book, with cafes, and taking my copy, and it was getting trash basically, and I was like, maybe there's a PDF copy because I don't want to take it with me anymore and ruin it. And I asked Anne for one, and there's not, and maybe because it doesn't work that way. It has to be an object, in a sense. It doesn't even work as photocopy, which is the way we in Latin America read most of the books. So, yes.
That's great. I have two if someone wants one. I'm happy to have two. I think this is, I was so enjoying listening to you, Avital, because, in that period, it was, if you were, I can't help but say, if you were in the social sciences, the idea of experimenting was nothing less than the end of you. Yeah. And it remains to me of great interest among people that think experimentation's difficult but allowed, in literature and performance, that the social sciences still remain, the basis of resistance. And whether we think about them or not, I'm always thinking we should, that they define science, for instance. So I think it's really bad, and I really meant it. I mean, looking at your book just drove me mad, actually. I didn't know how to think. When I started to think, what shall I do? Shall I say how it drove me mad? Because it was impossible. I didn't understand the tenure story exactly, but I didn't write a book until after tenure. I would have never, it was easier not to write at all than to let them see what I wanted to write, because I could get tenure that way for being a good teacher or something, whatever I did. Can't do it anymore, of course, but thank goodness. So there's something to my mind that I want to be careful about, and I thought Fred was sort of getting to it, I hope, Fred, about objects and the other and the object and in the object and all that, the thing about the telephone book and about it having a technological sort of substrate or all through it, however we talk about it, even though it can't be reproduced, it calls us again and again to think of experimentation in relationship to technology, whichever one it is. So while we can't change that book into certain kind, we can still think what other ones we must do. And I think I'm very pleased with this notion of the gray zone of all things and the gray technology, because it's the kind of technology that's not glamorous, and we sort of have to engage it politically and I think experimentally somehow, So I thank you, because it's implied in your book that we engage with the call, Was I right, Fred? Did you say that? You did.
I didn't know if you wanted to say something more, Fred, about sort of the when you're talking about the Dasein, the object, sort of the object in us, and maybe think about this book is in some sense prefiguring some of the thinking in object-oriented ontology or new materialisms.
Yes, I mean, there's early on in the book, and then I think it gets carried out all throughout the text. There's an anticipation, of a lot of the work that, and a distillation of the question that well, I was going to say it's a distillation of the question that seems to animate object-oriented ontology, but I actually don't think it really does animate object-oriented ontology. In other words, the breakdown of the opposition between others and things, which then immediately contaminates the opposition between selves and things, is something which I think, at least the stuff that I've read, I don't think that object-oriented ontology gets to that. And what's important, and what I was, maybe trying to gesture towards a little bit, is that, there's a material history of that relation that emerges in a kind of analytic of neither good nor bad, but impossible maternity that kind of animates Black studies. And, Spillers and Morrison Spillers publishes, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe in '87, and Beloved is published in '87. And it seems to me that what Avital is doing early on in this book in the maternalizing call is a reply and an answer and an extension, of a certain set of formulations that they're making there, and it opens those formulations out, into other bodies of work and into other canons, and I think that's really important.
And it's also motivated by Alexander Graham Bell's militant anti-racism, so that giving voice and technologically retrieving the other in defiance of the phobias of contact taboo was part of his commitment and thinking as well. This was also something launched against apartheid, another crypt and trauma that I was trying to lay a track down for as well. The thinking of contacting without touching, reaching out and touching, that phantasm, and all sorts of toxic invasions imagined by the other, and so on and so forth, all of which is very destabilized. You all know probably that the word phony in English comes from the telephone, meaning you can't stabilize the identity or really have a sense of whom you're speaking to, who's calling. That's why I try to trace and track the call of Heidegger, because what's calling is your finitude. Sorry.
But what's great in thinking about the phoniness that way, I'm just thinking, because Emma, you actually began with a kind of, a certain kind of phoniness too, because all the misrecognitions of Oedipus.
Yeah, can I just tell this crazy story of what happened at Daulis? That sort of appeared the other road that joins the road between Delphi and Thebes. So this is given in Ovid's Metamorphosis, which also brings up the transformation of others into things. And I'm not exactly sure what the historical context is in it's the zero date, really, that Ovid's writing in. That's going on, that's significant with regard to that. But so in this story, the king Tereus marries Procne, and he abandons her with their son Etis, and he then marries her sister Philomela, and he cuts out her tongue. And Philomela gets word to Procne, not by she doesn't call her on the telephone, but she weaves characters into a robe or a tapestry. Procne learns of the violence and betrayal and goes mad. And in her madness, she kills her son, Itis, and feeds him to Tereus. So Tereus eats his son. As a result of this, Procne and Philomela flee, pursued by Tereus, and all are transformed into birds. Procne into the nightingale, whose call is Itu, Itu, calling out for her son. Tereus into the hoopoe, who calls Pu, Pu, which means where in Greek. And Philomela into the voiceless, mute swallow. So, this resonates with all of so many of the stories that you tell in the book. It's just extraordinary.
The desire or to construct a text that dissolve the sovereignty of the book, like the more I've read your text, or the text titled The Telephone Book, the more times I've read it, the more I wondered if it's a letter that you received from Maurice Blanchot to step outside of the epoch, what he calls the epoch of the book. And this would be, which him and Nancy write so much to each other about, but when he writes that letter to Elijah Bojevich about the epoch of the book and that writing's fundamentally dangerous, and it's an epoch that we need to leave behind, and history's been left behind with it. I wondered sometimes if that letter ended up on your doorstep and you decided that you needed to dissolve the sovereignty of the book in a prologue or a publishing house inside academia instead of Alfred Knopf or something.
Thank you for the question, and I might put you on hold because tomorrow we're going to hear from outstanding speakers who may speak to that. The only thing I can say is that I didn't write it, all right? I didn't have a desire. Something seized me and so on. I'm more of a Nietzsche baby in the sense that something befell me. And boy, did it befall me. So nonetheless, you're right. There's a switchboard that has Blanchot's name written on it. There's, in the background, still a phantom switchboard that needed to be switched on would be Levinas. Very surprisingly, and I think we'll hear tomorrow as well, of those who were pumping electronic impulses to me, but who remained unnamed or somewhat effaced in this work. So I'm still perplexed by who got in, who had to be crowded out, and I'm trying to reconstruct the motivations and exigencies. But you're absolutely right that this was a Blanchot express, if one could imagine an express and Blanchot in the same breath.
My grandmother used the telephone in a creative way and also in a way that maybe intuitively intervened in this very low-level theme that came up in the discussions today, was the issue of desiring technology and the converse control that technology exerts perhaps in us in increasingly scary ways. So my grandmother would always, when I would leave eventually assisted living in New Jersey and come back to Manhattan, and she'd say, call me, or I'm gonna call you. I can't even remember now, but the injunction was do not pick up the phone. You know, don't answer the phone because then it'll cost money. So just, it'll ring once, hang it up, and I'll know that you got home. And anyway, all of these papers reminded me of that beautiful, this kind of paradoxical set of impulses to connect with the cord, but not to actually use it the way it was intended.
Thank you very much. I do, when you said as it was intended, when you see the utterly queer and surprising relationship of Alexander Graham Bell and his cohort, Watson, what they intended is so surprising and spooky that it's actually shocking that the telephone is used at all, because every telephone carries a corpse. And only California seems to understand that. You may know that Fairlawn, the cemetery, has live phone wires in many graves in case the dead want to call you. Whenever the phone rings, that's what's calling. Everything else is a repression, by the way. If you think it's your girlfriend or something.
Some things are better repressed.
The kind of nostalgic effect now of reading the beginning of the text, which is for the stable physical object of a telephone that actually does in its shape unite ear and mouth, which now my 4-year-old daughter, when she saw a Fisher-Price telephone, thought it was a car, and thinks of a telephone as a kind of operatory function of something that also shows videos and shows photos, and a phone call as being something completely separate from the communicative device of what people think of as a telephone. I mean, most people under 30 get calls from their mother and no one else, would prefer never to speak. And so I'm wondering about the resonance of the work when the telephone does become more of a function than an actual object.
I think I do try to address that as the telephone always having been the book of books in certain ways and containing world in a certain way that Heidegger, the strange thing about Heidegger is he called it. He called the question concerning technology. He saw the danger, he saw the fascination and so on, but he missed the call at the same time. So there's something like the difference that we could provisionally float between the essence of technology and a technological, let's say, dashboard or switchboard of sorts. So in the sense that Emma crucially showed us, there were telephonics beaming out and establishing cables with the ancient Greeks and so on. And in a sense, I mean, Heidegger says it's not the age of technology because there are machines. There are machines because it's the age of technology. So that was queued up right after the pre-Socratics, according to him, of course. And it's a mode of disclosure. And the one thing that got my attention is how much anxiety is pumped through these technologies. For Heidegger, anxiety is disclosive of understanding. I hope that's true because I must understand a lot. So I'm done.
I have a question to Fred Moten. Fred, thank you so much for your lecture and also for following Avital's remarks on the maternal. You've ended your sonata on the music discomposed and how it relates to the maternal and how it relates to the mother tongue, especially in ways that also echo your talk and cryptonomy, Maria to Rock, and the way that the maternal is always a provider of this symbolic paternal that this inscribes what it nonetheless wants to not provide, which is in many ways the law. And can this be I would be happy if you may be able also to elaborate it, because this is also a track of the animaternal and what is also echoed in Avital's book in terms of Nietzsche and the state, which is rendered as eventually as maternal, which has exactly this repressive functions and massive disown, and perhaps the law of the mother is eventually let go, as you've just said, but because the mother wants to be left alone. She doesn't want to let go because the child needs to have this being in the world, but she also wants to be left alone. This is the radical disownment that also Avital speaks about, goes both ways. So can you maybe elaborate on that?
Well, when you say the mother wants to be left alone, I want to say whose mother are you talking about? And so part of what, we put the definite article to good use sometimes, and sometimes to not so good use. And there are a range of different, historical modalities that if we think through them, and acknowledge them and pay some attention to them, it contaminates, let's say a certain kind of purity that unhappily sort of, incarcerates or encapsulates a certain kind of phrase like the mother, all right? It's not like I'm trying to say that there is some other kind of mother that doesn't want to be let go. It's just that I'm saying that there's an internal difference, it seems to me, within every possible figuration of the mother that has to complicate this particular understanding of maternal desire. And there's a chance, it seems to me, embedded there in those fissures and disruptions that that I think allows us to imagine something that won't just be recycled into a kind of, into, this sort of viciousness and brutality of a certain kind of paternal substitution, right? And that's what I'm interested in, and that's what, and I think it has everything to do with the undecidability of these gaps, between thing and self, thing and other, that, and ultimately between thing and nothing, about which much ado has been made for 400 or 500 years. So, yeah, so that's what I'm saying is that, I think that there's some other stuff going on there, or the potential, the possibility of some other stuff going on there. But it requires, I think, inhabiting and even falling through all these cracks and fissures and escape hatches, that Avital's work makes possible, as a function of the pressure that it brings to bear, on the paternal belly of the state, which is her phrase,
I'm thinking we might do something really radical at an academic event, which is actually to end this panel on time. So please join me in thanking this wonderful group of speakers. And in the spirit of the formal innovations that the telephone book makes, we've also, both days were actually concluding the sort of the presentations with performative interventions. So I want to introduce Ethan Philbrick of the Department of Performance Studies here at NYU, and who's going to do some operating of his own of the telephone book and with the telephone book.
What I'm about to play is working mostly with or around the text, the words that are found on the pages, and it starts from the very last page, just before the notes. It's just a page just with a quote from Kafka, and it starts there, and then it's a fragmented piece that goes from there. And then all the musical content of it is using a sort of telephonic serialism. So it's the numerology of the telephone number, but with the numbers assigned to the pitches in a scale. So it's starting with, I use the number that is the house I was born in, and then all the area codes of New York are in there too.